Holiday season, at least in the UK, is fast approaching, and if you are planning a journey to a faraway haven of tranquility, or just taking a break from day-to-day troubles, it's hard to imagine a better companion than another beautiful modern abstract game from this niche in the hobby that seem to owe some of their aesthetic and mechanics to classic games such as Go or chess, and yet are something all of their own. Enter Shōbu, a game that at first glance could be mistaken for an ambitious game of drafts, and is so tactile and traditional in its design that I was honestly surprised that it only came out in 2019. Like many of its brethren within this category of board games, Shōbu's rules are really simple. In fact, this is the first game I've played with a 4-page rulebook, where I thought the creators had still overdone the rules explanations a bit. Each player takes 2 wooden boards, 1 light and 1 dark, and arranges them in front of them. These will form the player's home boards and are separated from their opponent's home boards by a dividing rope. On each board will be placed 4 light-coloured river stones, which will be arranged along the edge closest to the light player, and 4 dark-coloured river stones arranged on the opposite edge. Starting with the player controlling the darker stones, the players will take turns to manipulate these stones with the objective of pushing all of their opponent's stones from any one of the 4 boards. Each turn consists of 2 moves. First, the active player must make a passive move, in which they will choose any one of their stones and move it in an unblocked direction up to 2 spaces. During this first move, they may not push any other stones, but may otherwise move in any direction, including diagonally, as long as their stone does not leave the board. Once the passive move is complete, they must immediately make a so-called aggressive move. The aggressive move requires them to select any of their stones on one of the opposite coloured boards to the board on which the passive move took place. This stone must move the same number of spaces and in the same direction as the passive move, but in so doing they may push a single one of their opponent's stones to an unoccupied space or off the board. No more than one of your stones may be pushed by your opponent at one time, so one possible strategy is to place stones next to each other in such an orientation as to block your opponent from pushing them. But with 4 boards to protect at all times, judging when to use both moves defensively and when to be aggressive is critical to your success. Once complete, play passes to the other player to take their turn, and so on until one player loses as a result of having no stones left on one of the 4 boards. If you are unable to make an aggressive move that matches the direction and distance of the passive move, then the passive move itself is invalid, so it often makes sense to plan your movements in reverse order, first identifying your optimal aggressive move, and then figuring out the passive move that will enable it. Those are the only rules. The game is streamlined to its very essence. There are no extraneous niche rules or elements of random chance, nor is the game encumbered by any attempt to introduce a backstory or setting. The story of Shōbu is simply the contest of wits between you and your opponent. Shōbu is exceptionally quick to learn, but mastering it is another matter. One thing that will strike you early on is just how many possible moves and combinations of moves are theoretically possible at any given moment in the game. Consider that there are 36 possible opening passive moves, 18 on each home board, at the start of the game alone, and this only increases as your stones advance into more open positions. Just one of your 16 stones, whilst unobstructed, can have up to 11 available moves, with very different consequences, and the multiplication of these choices can quickly become intimidating. If ever a game exemplified the notion that a simple rule set doesn't have to make a game predictable, Shōbu is probably that game. It's perhaps useful at this point to compare Shōbu to another abstract game that we have already reviewed on the channel, Onitama. In theory, both games contain no hidden information. You always have visibility of the moves that will be available to your opponent during their next turn, and in principle it should be possible to anticipate the consequences of your move as a result. However, each card enabling movement in Onitama will typically allow no more than 4 possible moves with a given piece. If your opponent happens to have no cards that permit directly forward movement, for example, that's a whole category of threats that you can rule out before you move. Shōbu, in contrast, is a little like trying to play 4 games of drafts simultaneously on boards that interact with each other. There is no hidden information, but at the same time so much information that it can be difficult to anticipate your opponent's move for one turn, never mind several turns down the road. But the game is not necessarily the chaos that it may first appear. Because an aggressive move must be preceded by a mirror move on an opposite coloured home board, it follows that your opponent can only remove stones from your home boards via a passive move on their home board of opposite colour. If no such move is available, then you can rest assured that the stones on these boards are, for one turn at least, safe from attack, even if they are in positions that might otherwise seem vulnerable. This seemingly innocuous restriction slowly narrows your available strategies and those of your opponent as the game progresses. There is pressure on both players to develop the positioning of pieces on both of their home boards to create maximum flexibility of movement during their aggressive moves. At the same time, doing so inevitably increases the number of possible moves you must account for and can leave your stones vulnerable. Even when you think you're behind in Shōbu, there remain methods of placing your opponent under pressure. The inability to push more than one stone at a time, and never one of your own stones, creates an opportunity for a player with a number disadvantage on a given board to use their opponent's stones as a means of protection. Wedge one of your stones directly between two of your opponents, as shown here, and neither of your opponent's stones will be able to remove it, at least for now. Additionally, as you lose pieces, you start to focus in on your own possible moves more clearly because, somewhat obviously, there are less possible moves to choose from. External appearance to the contrary, the designers of this game appear to have got the balance of this just right. The idea of trying to manage 4 independent but interlinked boards should be too much, but it isn't. Shōbu still provides a real workout for the brain, but not an insurmountable one. Almost anyone could play a game of Shōbu, from children to the elderly, and from board game aficionados to someone who has never picked up a board game before. But this isn't to say that they would play it well. As I said about Onitama, and as is the case for many of this type of abstract game, the game has little to commiserate those players that find themselves significantly better or worse than their opponent. The gap between players in terms of skill can be quite large with Shōbu, and there's not much either player can do about such a situation. Whilst most of the NSG team would, I think, say that Shōbu is a very good, well-constructed and clever game, I'm less confident these attributes are enough to make it a first choice for all of us. Perhaps the challenge of getting a game of Shōbu in is not finding an opponent who will play it, but rather finding an opponent with whom you are matched evenly enough that they will want to play it twice. The game has an elegance of aesthetic that is not to be understated. I love the real wood boards, albeit they do make the game smell like a DIY store in summer, and the tactile pleasure of holding the weighty stones, along with the sound they make as they touch the board, transports me to simpler times. Truth be told, the weight and size of the boards and stones means that this is a much larger and heavier box than is ideal for travel, perhaps better suited to a staycation or domestic holiday than one involving an international flight. But despite its capacity to reduce your brain to a bubbling mess, its minimalist form carries a certain kind of serenity. It would not seem out of place on a beach or in the shade of a tree in some country house. As you can probably tell, Shōbu is a game awash with paradox. Modern with a traditional feel, a simplistic set of rules for a game that will break your brain, a game accessible to anyone, but that dependent on your opponent may feel completely unplayable. Somehow it manages to ride out all of this contradiction and earns its place as a quintessential example of the abstract games genre. Its tagline, "Beautifully challenging," is not so much hyperbole as a declaration of intent, and one I am delighted to say it fulfills. But does that mean you should buy it? I'll let you know when my brain stops hurting. Shōbu marks our 10th core game review on the channel, and we have plenty more games we want to crow about or cringe about, to say nothing of our playthroughs, painting videos and other content. So if you haven't already, why not subscribe and be among the first to enjoy our future videos. If your luggage restrictions leave no room for a couple of choice board games, don't worry, we're not going anywhere this summer, and wherever you end up in the world we should still be accessible to help you manage the withdrawal until you can roll some dice once more. Safe travels, dear viewers, and be sure to work hard, play better, and take care out there.